The candles had barely been lit when Evelina Marsh felt the weight of the ring settle on her finger like a stone dropped into still water. The chapel was full of people smiling at her, but she could not make herself smile back. Duke Alistair Rowan stood beside her, tall and composed, saying his vows in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the old stone church. She said hers too, but her voice cracked on the final word, and she saw several guests exchange glances. No one asked her if she was well. No one ever did. The wedding breakfast stretched on for hours, filled with toasts and laughter that felt like it belonged to someone else's celebration. Evelina sat at the head table beside her new husband, nodding at compliments, accepting congratulations, and eating almost nothing. Alistair noticed. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly around her glass, the way her eyes kept drifting toward the tall windows, as if she wished she could climb through them and disappear. He told himself it was nerves. Every bride felt nerves. By the time the guests began to leave, the sun had dropped low behind the hills, painting the estate in shades of orange and gray. Alistair excused himself from a conversation with his uncle and went looking for his bride, expecting to find her resting in her new chambers. Instead, a maid told him she had slipped out to the garden alone nearly half an hour earlier. He found her sitting on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, her wedding gown spread around her like spilled cream, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She had not heard him approach. For a moment he simply stood there, unsure whether to speak or to leave her to whatever grief had claimed her. "Evelina," he said gently. She startled, wiping her face quickly with the back of her gloved hand, but the tears kept coming even as she tried to compose herself. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I did not mean for anyone to see. You do not have to hide from me," Alistair said, taking a careful step closer. "We are married now. Whatever troubles you, you can tell me." She shook her head, pressing her lips together as though holding back words that wanted to escape. "It is nothing, Your Grace. Only tiredness. Weddings are exhausting for everyone." He did not believe her, but he could see that pressing further would only push her away faster. He had heard enough stories from other men of his rank, men who married young women from struggling families, women who wept not from joy but from the weight of duty pressed upon them since childhood. He assumed this was simply another version of that story. A woman who did not choose her husband, forced instead by circumstance and family debt, weeping for the life she might have had instead. "I will leave you in peace then," he said, though something in his chest ached at the thought of walking away from his own wife on their wedding night. "If you need anything, you have only to call for me." She nodded without meeting his eyes, and he turned and walked back toward the house, glancing over his shoulder once to see her still sitting beneath the oak tree, small and still, like a statue carved from sorrow. That night, Evelina did not come to his chambers. He waited for over an hour before a maid delivered a message saying the Duchess was feeling unwell and wished to sleep alone. Alistair read the note twice, then folded it and set it on the table beside his bed. He was not an unreasonable man. He would not force his presence where it was not wanted. But sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, his mind was full of questions he had no answers to. He rose twice in the night, once to pace the length of his chamber, and once to stand at his window looking out over the dark gardens, wondering if she was still awake somewhere in the house, staring at her own ceiling, carrying whatever weight had followed her into this marriage. He thought of calling for a servant to check on her, then decided against it. She had asked for solitude. He would give her that much, even if every instinct in him wanted to knock on her door and demand to know what had put such sorrow in her eyes. He thought too of his own parents, of the easy affection they had shared even in their later years, his father's hand always finding his mother's during long carriage rides, her laughter filling rooms he now walked through in near silence. He had imagined in some quiet corner of his mind that his own marriage might grow into something similar given time. He had not expected joy to arrive immediately, but he had not expected this either, this careful distance, this sense that his bride was guarding herself against him, as though he were a danger rather than a partner. By the time morning light began to creep through the curtains, he had made a private promise to himself. Whatever burden his wife carried, he would not add to it through impatience or wounded pride. He would give her time, and in that time, he would try, however clumsily, to become someone she might eventually trust. The following morning, he found Evelina already awake and dressed, standing at the window of the breakfast room with a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She turned when he entered, offering him a polite good morning, her expression calm and composed as though the previous night had never happened. But her eyes told a different story. They were red-rimmed, tired, guarded. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, taking his seat across from her. "Well enough," she said, which he understood to mean not at all. Their conversation over breakfast was stiff, formal. The kind of exchange one might have with a stranger seated beside them on a long carriage ride. She asked about his plans for the day. He asked about hers. She mentioned she intended to walk the grounds and perhaps visit the small chapel near the eastern boundary of the estate. He offered to accompany her, and for a moment, he thought he saw panic flash across her face before she quickly declined, saying she preferred to walk alone to clear her mind after the excitement of the wedding. He let her go. He told himself that a new bride needed time to adjust to her new home, her new title, her new life, entirely separate from the one she had known. He busied himself with estate matters, meeting with his steward about the autumn harvest, reviewing correspondence from his solicitor, anything to keep his mind from wandering back to the image of his wife crying alone beneath the oak tree. But it was difficult not to notice things once he had begun looking. At dinner that evening, Evelina ate slowly, pushing food around her plate more than actually eating it. She answered his questions with short, careful responses, never offering more than what was asked. When he made a small joke about his aunt's insistence on inspecting every corner of the estate before the wedding, hoping to coax a smile from her, she managed only the faintest curve of her lips before it faded just as quickly as it had appeared. He began to study her more carefully after that. Not in a way meant to make her uncomfortable, but the quiet observation of a man trying to understand a puzzle he had unexpectedly become part of. He noticed she wore long sleeves even in the warmth of the afternoon. He noticed she flinched slightly whenever a door closed too loudly. He noticed that she always positioned herself facing the entrance of any room she sat in, as though watching for someone, or something, that might come through it. He noticed, too, the small rituals she kept without seeming to realize she kept them. She touched the chain at her throat whenever a conversation grew too personal, as though reassuring herself of something hidden beneath her collar. She read the same page of her book for several minutes without turning it, her eyes fixed on the words but clearly seeing something else entirely. She thanked the servants with unusual gentleness, as though grateful simply for the ordinary kindness of being spoken to without expectation. One afternoon, he came upon her in the small library, standing before a shelf of poetry with a single volume held loosely in her hands, unopened. She did not hear him enter, and for a long moment he watched her simply stand there, motionless, her thumb tracing the worn edge of the book's spine. When she finally noticed him, she startled and quickly returned the book to its shelf, though not quickly enough to hide the way her eyes had glistened before she blinked the emotion away. "Forgive me," she said. "I was only browsing." "You need not apologize for reading," he said gently, though he suspected the book held some meaning beyond its pages. "Take whatever you like. The library is as much yours now as mine." She thanked him quietly and left the room without taking the volume, and Alistair found himself, once she had gone, walking to the shelf and searching for the book she had held. It was a slim collection of love poems, unremarkable in itself, save for the faint impression on its spine suggesting it had been opened and closed many times before. He set it back exactly as he had found it, troubled anew by how much of his wife's inner life remained locked away from him, hidden behind careful silences and half-finished gestures he did not yet know how to read. 3 days after the wedding, Alistair found himself standing outside her chamber door in the late evening, hand raised to knock, uncertain what he even intended to say. He lowered his hand before making contact and instead stood there a moment longer, listening. Through the heavy wood, he thought he heard the faint sound of her voice, speaking softly to no one, the words too muffled to make out. He told himself it was nothing. Perhaps she was praying. Perhaps she was simply speaking her thoughts aloud, as some people did when alone. He walked away that night more troubled than before. Something about his new wife did not fit the simple explanation he had given himself. Arranged marriages brought sorrow, yes, but this felt different. This felt like something carried, something hidden, something that lived beneath her calm exterior like a stone sinking slowly through deep water, pulling her down with it. Over the following week, Alistair made a quiet decision. He would not press her, not yet, not in a way that would frighten her further into silence. But he would watch, and he would learn, and eventually he would understand why the woman who now shared his name had not smiled once since the moment she became his wife. He did not yet know what he would find. He only knew that whatever it was, it mattered more than his own wounded pride, and more than the awkward silence that had settled over their new life together like a fog that refused to lift. Evelina, for her part, spent those same quiet days building walls even higher than the ones she had carried into the marriage. She had not expected kindness from the Duke. She had expected indifference, perhaps mild disappointment once he realized what kind of wife he had gained. Instead, she found herself watched by careful, patient eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted them to. It frightened her more than anger would have. Anger she knew how to survive. understanding she was not prepared for. Each night, after the household had gone quiet and the candles had burned low, she retreated to a small locked room in the east wing that no servant was permitted to enter without her direct instruction. There, surrounded by things only she understood the meaning of, she allowed herself the only honesty she could afford, and each morning, she rebuilt the calm mask she wore for the rest of the world, including the husband who was beginning, slowly and carefully, to ask questions she was not ready to answer. Neither of them spoke of it directly in those early days, but something had begun between them nonetheless, quiet and uncertain, the first thread in a story neither had chosen but both would eventually have to face together. A letter had arrived from her mother that first week, congratulating her on the match and reminding her, in careful phrasing, of how much the family's fortunes now depended on her success in the role. Evelina had read it standing in the hallway, her face carefully blank, before folding it and tucking it away without comment. Alistair, passing by at the time, had noticed only the stiffness in her shoulders, another small clue he filed away alongside the others, unable yet to see the fuller picture they were slowly forming. 2 weeks into the marriage, life at Rowan Estate had settled into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. Evelina managed the household with quiet efficiency, reviewing menus with the cook, inspecting linens with the housekeeper, and greeting visitors with the practiced grace expected of a duchess. She never raised her voice, she never complained. The staff, within days, had come to respect her thoroughness, even if a few of the older servants whispered among themselves about how rarely she laughed, how her eyes seemed fixed somewhere far away even when she was standing right in front of them. Alistair noticed the whispers too, though he said nothing. He had grown up in this house, knew every creaking floorboard and every servant who had served his family for decades. He trusted their instincts, and their instincts told him something was wrong long before he had the words to explain it himself. It was a Tuesday evening when he first noticed the desk. He had gone looking for Evelina to discuss an upcoming dinner with a neighboring family, and found her study empty, the door left slightly ajar. On her writing desk sat a stack of letters, and beside them, a small brass key resting on top of a leather folio. As he stepped closer, not intending to pry but simply curious about the correspondence of his new wife, she appeared suddenly in the doorway, her face draining of color.
"Your Grace,"
she said, her voice tight.
"I did not expect you."
"I was looking for you to discuss the Ashworth dinner," he said carefully, watching her cross the room quickly to gather the letters and the key, tucking them into a drawer she locked with practiced speed. "I did not mean to disturb your correspondence." "It is nothing," she said, too quickly. "Old letters. Nothing of importance." He said nothing more about it that evening, but he noticed the way her hands shook slightly as she poured tea for their guests the following week. He noticed how she always kept that particular drawer locked, how the key never left the small chain she wore hidden beneath the collar of her dress. He began to understand that whatever weighed on his wife's heart was not a passing sadness. It was something deliberate, something guarded, something she protected with the same care one might use to protect a wound that had never properly healed. He thought of asking her outright, more than once. He rehearsed the words in his mind during long rides across the estate, imagining how he might phrase the question gently enough that she would not retreat further behind her careful walls. Each time he lost his nerve, not from cowardice but from a growing respect for whatever process she seemed to need in her own time. He had begun to understand that some doors, once forced open too soon, could never truly be trusted again, even after they were closed and locked once more. Instead, he found other ways to show her steadiness. When a merchant in the village overcharged her for fabric, assuming the new duchess would not know the difference, Alistair quietly corrected the matter without making her feel foolish for the mistake. When she mentioned, almost in passing, that she missed the particular blend of tea her mother used to prepare, he sent a servant to acquire it from a shop 3 towns over without telling her until the parcel arrived. Small gestures, nothing grand, but each one a quiet message that he was paying attention, that he cared about the details of her comfort even when she offered him little in return. Evelina noticed these gestures more than she let on. She said nothing of them directly, but Margaret later remarked to Alistair that the Duchess had kept the tea tin on her nightstand rather than sending it to the kitchen stores, as though it were something precious rather than merely useful. It was a small sign, easily missed, but Alistair held on to it as evidence that his patience was not entirely wasted. The chapel visits became another piece of the puzzle. Every Sunday, without fail, Evelina walked alone to the small stone chapel near the eastern edge of the estate grounds, a modest building rarely used since Alistair's grandmother had passed many years before. She would return an hour later, her eyes red, her composure just barely intact, When he once offered to walk with her, she declined so quickly and so firmly that he did not ask again, though the refusal stayed with him long after she had left the room. He began asking quiet questions of the household staff, not out of suspicion of wrongdoing, but out of genuine concern for a woman who seemed to be drowning slowly in something no one around her could see. The housekeeper, an older woman named Margaret who had served the family since Alistair was a boy, hesitated when he asked if she knew anything of Evelina's life before the marriage. "I only know what everyone in the village knows, Your Grace," Margaret said carefully. The Marsh family fell into hardship 2 years past. There was talk of a debt, and talk that the young miss had once been set to marry another before circumstances changed. "Another?" Alistair asked, his interest sharpening. "Who?" Margaret shook her head. "I could not say for certain, sir. It was not spoken of openly, only whispered among those who remembered. Perhaps it is not my place to speak further on it." Alistair thanked her and let the matter rest, but the words stayed lodged in his mind like a splinter beneath skin. A previous engagement. Circumstances changed. It explained much, and yet it explained nothing at all, because engagements were broken and mended, and broken again among families of standing, and rarely did they leave a woman so thoroughly hollowed by grief that she could not manage a single genuine smile even months later. He tried, in his own quiet way, to bridge the distance between them. He began joining her for the walk to the stables in the mornings, saying little, simply offering his presence as a steady companion rather than an interrogator. He complimented her management of the household, genuinely and specifically, noting the improvements she had made to the kitchen gardens and the careful way she had reorganized the linen stores. Slowly, so slowly he almost did not notice it happening, she began to relax slightly in his presence. She still did not smile, not truly, but her shoulders no longer tensed quite so sharply when he entered a room, and her answers to his questions grew a little longer, a little more willing. One evening, as autumn settled fully over the estate, and the leaves outside turned deep shades of copper and rust, they sat together in the drawing room after dinner, a rare moment of quiet companionship. Alistair read from a book of poetry his mother had once loved, and Evelina sat with her needlework in her lap, though her hands had stilled entirely as she listened. "You have a pleasant reading voice," she said softly, the first unprompted compliment she had offered him since their wedding day. He looked up, surprised and pleased in equal measure. "Thank you. My mother used to say the same thing, though I suspect she was simply being kind." A small silence settled between them, comfortable rather than strained, and for a moment Alistair allowed himself to hope that whatever distance separated them might eventually close on its own, given enough patience and enough time. "Read me another," she said quietly, surprising him. He obliged, choosing a poem about autumn light and the slow turning of seasons, his voice low and unhurried in the firelit room. When he finished, he glanced up to find her watching him rather than her needlework, an expression on her face he could not quite name, something between curiosity and a wary sort of warmth she seemed almost afraid to fully allow herself. "My mother used to read to me when I was young," she said, so quietly he almost missed it over the crackle of the fire. "Before everything changed, I had nearly forgotten how much I loved it. Then I will read to you often," he said simply, "if it brings you even a small measure of comfort." She did not answer, but she did not look away either, and for the length of several heartbeats, something unspoken passed between them, fragile and new, like the first thin ice forming over a pond at the start of winter, not yet strong enough to bear real weight, but present all the same, a sign of something beginning to take shape. But the moment did not last. A servant entered with an urgent message regarding a matter in the eastern wing, something about a broken window near the sealed room that no one but the Duchess held the key to. Evelina's face changed instantly, the softness disappearing as though it had never existed, replaced by a tight, controlled panic that she fought visibly to suppress. "I will attend to it myself," she said, rising so quickly her needlework fell to the floor unnoticed. "There is no need for anyone else to trouble themselves." Alistair rose as well. "I can accompany you. If something is broken, it should be repaired properly." "No," she said, sharper than she had ever spoken to him before, and then, seeing his surprise, softened her tone with visible effort. "Forgive me. I only mean that I know exactly what is needed. I will not be long." She left the room quickly, leaving Alistair standing alone amid the fallen needlework and the half-read book of poetry, his earlier hope tangled now with a deepening unease. Whatever lay behind that locked door in the east wing, it was clearly the center of everything, the source from which all her carefully guarded sorrow seemed to flow. And though he had promised himself patience, though he understood that trust could not be forced, He also knew that he could not simply watch his wife disappear a little more each day into whatever grief consumed her, unable to help, because she would not let him near enough to try. That night, long after the house had gone silent, he stood once more outside that locked door, hand resting against the old wood, listening to the faint sound of movement within. He did not knock. He did not demand entry. He simply stood there, a silent witness to a grief he could not yet name, promising himself that whatever it took, however long it required, he would find a way to help the woman behind that door find her way back into the light. He thought of knocking softly, of speaking her name through the wood, of telling her simply that he was there, that she did not have to explain herself, only that she was not entirely alone in whatever hour of the night had driven her from her bed to this locked room. But he held back, unsure whether such an intrusion, however gently intended, would be received as comfort or as trespass. In the end, he simply stood there a while longer, listening to the faint sound of paper being turned, of a chair creaking softly under quiet weight, until eventually he returned to his own chamber, carrying with him an ache he had not expected marriage to bring, the particular loneliness of caring deeply for someone who had not yet decided whether he could be trusted. He did not sleep well that night, nor for several nights afterward, his mind circling endlessly around the mystery of the locked room, and the name Margaret had mentioned only in passing. A previous engagement. Circumstances changed. He turned the words over and over, searching for the shape of a story he could not yet see clearly, aware only that whatever had happened before their marriage had left a mark on his wife deep enough to still govern her every movement, months after their vows had been spoken. The broken window in the east wing turned out to be nothing more than a loose shutter struck by an autumn storm, but the incident left Alistair more determined than ever to understand what lay behind the locked door his wife guarded so fiercely. He had stood outside that room while the carpenter made his repairs, watching Evelina hover nearby with an anxious tension that made clear she trusted no one else to witness even the smallest glimpse of what lay within, not even for the few minutes necessary to fix a broken pane of glass. She had insisted on being present the entire time, her eyes never leaving the workman's hands, and had thanked him with visible relief once the task was complete and the door once more secured behind its lock. He did not attempt to force his way in. He respected her enough, even in his uncertainty, to know that trust broken by force would never truly heal. Instead, he continued his quiet observations, piecing together fragments of a picture that grew clearer and more troubling with each passing week. It was a conversation with his old friend Edmund Blackwood, a magistrate from the neighboring county, that finally gave him the thread he needed to pull. Edmund had come to dine at Rowan Estate on business regarding a shared property boundary, and over brandy after the meal, the conversation turned, as it often did among men of standing, to matters of local gossip. "The Marsh family," Edmund said, swirling his glass thoughtfully. "Tragic business, that. I handled some of the paperwork myself, though it was 2 years back now." Alistair's attention sharpened immediately. "What paperwork was that?" "The young man's death. Her intended, before the debt forced the family's hand and she was married off to you instead, if I understand the timeline correctly." Edmund paused, seeming to notice for the first time the intensity of Alistair's expression. "Forgive me. I assumed you knew the full circumstances." "I know very little," Alistair admitted. "Tell me what you know." Edmund set down his glass, his expression turning grave. His name was Edmund Hale, a gentleman of modest fortune but good family, engaged to Miss Marsh for nearly a year before their planned wedding. He died suddenly, the night before the ceremony was meant to take place. A fever, if I recall the coroner's report correctly, though it came on with terrible speed. The family was devastated. I remember hearing that Miss Marsh herself was inconsolable for weeks afterward. Alistair sat in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves rapidly in his mind. The locked room, the Sunday visits to the old chapel, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the way grief seemed to live permanently behind her careful composure. It was not indifference to their marriage that haunted her. It was mourning, raw and unresolved, for a man she had been meant to marry, cut short by death on the very eve of their wedding. "Did she love him greatly, do you know?" Alistair asked, the question escaping before he had fully decided to ask it. Edmund gave him a considering look. "From what I recall of the talk at the time, yes, quite deeply. They had known each other since childhood, I believe, their families being close neighbors. It was considered something of a certainty for years before the engagement was formally announced, the sort of match everyone expected long before it happened, which perhaps made the loss all the crueler, for there had been no doubt in anyone's mind that they would spend their lives together. Alistair absorbed this in silence, feeling the shape of his wife's grief grow heavier and more understandable with every detail. It was not the ordinary sorrow of a broken engagement, easily mended by time and a new match. It was the sudden, violent severing of a future that had felt entirely certain, taken from her in the space of 3 days by an illness no one could have predicted or prevented. "And the family's debt?" Alistair asked, his voice quieter now. "Came shortly after, from what I understand. Bad investments, worsened by the funeral costs and the loss of the match Hale's family would have brought them through connection. Within a year, the Marsh family found themselves in dire circumstances, and your own father, may he rest well, arranged the match with you before his passing, to settle what was owed and secure her future." Alistair remembered now, vaguely, conversations with his father in the final months before his death, mentions of an arrangement being finalized, a young woman of good family who needed a stable match. He had been traveling at the time, occupied with matters of his own, and had trusted his father's judgment without asking too many questions about the woman he would eventually marry. He had never imagined that behind the arrangement lay a story of such profound and recent loss. "Does she know that I know so little of this?" Alistair asked. "I could not say," Edmund replied. "Grief of that kind is not easily discussed, particularly not with a new husband one barely knows. Perhaps she assumed the arrangement itself explained enough, or perhaps she simply could not bring herself to speak of it at all." After Edmund departed the following morning, Alistair found himself walking the grounds alone, turning the revelation over in his mind again and again. He thought of the letters she guarded so carefully, likely written by or to Edmund Hale during their engagement. He thought of the locked room, probably containing whatever belongings remained of a life she had expected to build with another man entirely. He thought of the Sunday chapel visits, and suspected now that she was not simply praying, but visiting some marker or memorial dedicated to the man she had lost. He understood now why she could not smile. It was not that she resented her marriage to him specifically. It was that she had not yet been given the chance to properly grieve the marriage, and the man she had lost before their wedding could ever take place. Forced so quickly into a new engagement to settle her family's debts, she had never been permitted the time or space to mourn. Society expected brides to be joyful, families expected daughters to fulfill their duty without complaint, and somewhere in the machinery of arrangement and obligation, Evelina's grief had simply been packed away, locked behind a door, hidden beneath a composed and careful mask. The question now was what to do with this understanding. He could confront her directly, but he feared that would only frighten her further, confirming her belief that her grief was something shameful to be hidden, rather than something natural to be honored. He could continue his patient, quiet approach, waiting for her to trust him enough to share the truth herself, but he worried that her sorrow, left unaddressed for so long, might continue to deepen rather than heal. He considered, too, writing to her family directly, or seeking out someone who had known Edmund Hale personally, hoping to better understand the man his wife had loved so completely. He decided against it in the end, recognizing that such an approach, however well-intentioned, risked feeling to Evelina like an invasion of the one part of her life she had kept entirely her own. Whatever she chose to share with him would mean far more coming from her, in her own time and her own words, than anything he might learn secondhand from strangers who had merely observed her grief from a polite distance. He decided, in the end, to do neither directly. Instead, he began making small, careful gestures meant to communicate without words that he understood grief took many forms, and that he would not judge her for carrying hers. He mentioned, casually over dinner one evening, that his own mother had grieved his father's passing for years before she felt able to speak of him without tears, and that he had come to understand grief as something that could not be rushed, only endured with patience and support. Evelina's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her hands stilled over her plate, and for a long moment she simply looked at him, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "You speak wisely for a man who has not yet lost someone he deeply loved," she said quietly. "Perhaps not," he admitted. "But I have watched others carry such losses, and I have learned, I hope, something of patience in witnessing it." She said nothing more that evening, but the following Sunday, when she prepared for her usual solitary walk to the chapel, she paused at the door and looked back at him where he sat reading in the drawing room. "Would you care to walk with me today?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the invitation cost her something significant to offer. Alistair set down his book carefully, hiding the surprise and hope that surged through him at her words. "I would be honored," he said simply, and rose to join her. They walked together in silence along the familiar path toward the eastern chapel, the autumn air crisp and cool around them, fallen leaves crunching softly beneath their feet. Evelina said nothing during the walk, and Alistair did not press her to. When they reached the small stone building, she hesitated at the entrance, her hand resting against the old wooden door. "There is something I must show you," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "Something I have not spoken of to anyone since it happened. I do not know if I am ready, but I find that I no longer wish to carry it entirely alone." Alistair reached out, taking her hand gently in his own, the first time he had done so since their wedding day. "Whenever you are ready," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her careful composure, and then, slowly, she pushed open the chapel door and stepped inside, drawing him with her into whatever truth waited within. Inside the small chapel, dust motes drifted through thin beams of afternoon light falling from narrow windows set high in the stone walls. Evelina led Alistair past the modest rows of wooden pews toward a small side alcove near the front of the building, a space he had never noticed on the rare occasions he had visited the chapel himself in years past. There, resting on a simple stone shelf, sat a collection of items arranged with obvious care. A folded letter, yellowed slightly with age. A small portrait miniature, the kind often exchanged between engaged couples. A pressed flower, brittle and faded, preserved beneath a small piece of glass. "His name was Edmund Hale," Evelina said, her voice steady despite the tears already gathering in her eyes. "We were to be married in the spring, 2 years ago now. I loved him since I was 16 years old, since before I fully understood what love meant. He asked for my hand when I was 19, and I believe I have never known a happier day than the one he did." Alistair remained silent, allowing her the space to continue at her own pace, though every word confirmed what Edmund Blackwood had told him, and every word deepened his understanding of the woman standing before him. "He fell ill 3 days before our wedding," she continued, picking up the small portrait and holding it gently in her hands. "A fever, sudden and terrible, the kind the physicians could do nothing to slow. I sat beside him for those 3 days, holding his hand, praying to every saint I could name, promising anything if only he might be spared. He was not spared. He died the night before we were meant to stand together at the altar, in the very dress I had already had fitted for the ceremony." Her voice broke slightly on the final words, and Alistair stepped closer, though he did not reach for her, sensing she needed to finish what she had begun. "I do not think I have properly cried since that week," she admitted. "There was so much to manage. His funeral, the whispers from those who thought perhaps I had brought some misfortune upon him, my own family's grief, tangled with their growing fear about the debts that had already begun mounting before his death, debts his family's connection would have helped ease. And then, within the year, the arrangement with your father, and suddenly I was to be married again, to a man I had never met, expected to smile and accept my fortune and be grateful for the security this new match provided. I remember the morning after he died," she continued, her voice growing distant, as though she were speaking from somewhere far away. "My mother came into my room and told me I must rise and dress, that there were arrangements to be made, that the household could not fall into disorder simply because tragedy had struck. I remember thinking it strange that the world expected me to continue moving forward as though a piece of my own heart had not just been buried alongside him. I wore black for the appropriate months, and then I was told, quite plainly, that the mourning period had ended, and that I must begin thinking of my family's future instead of dwelling further on my own loss. That seems a cruel expectation to place on anyone," Alistair said. "Perhaps it was simply practical," Evelina replied, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe her own words. "My family needed the security a new match could bring. I understood the necessity even as I resented it. I told myself that grief was a luxury I could no longer afford, that I must learn to set it aside for the sake of those who depended on me. I did not realize until much later that grief does not simply disappear because one wills it to. It only goes into hiding, waiting for a moment when it can no longer be contained." "You were never given the chance to grieve," Alistair said quietly, finally understanding the full shape of what she had carried alone for so long. "No," she said, meeting his eyes for the first time since they had entered the chapel. "I was told, gently but firmly, that dwelling on the past would serve no one, that I owed it to my family to move forward, to be grateful, to smile for the sake of appearances even when my heart still ached as though the wound were fresh. I tried, Your Grace. I truly did try. But I found I could not simply command my grief to end because circumstance demanded it." "You do not have to call me Your Grace when we are alone," Alistair said gently. "And you never had to hide this from me. I wish you had trusted me sooner, though I understand now why you could not." "I feared you would think me disloyal," she admitted. A wife still mourning another man, keeping his letters locked away, visiting his memorial each week instead of embracing the life I had been given. I feared you would be angry, or worse, that you would pity me, and I could not bear either. Alistair shook his head slowly. I am neither angry, nor do I pity you. I am only sorry that you carried this alone for so long, when you did not have to. Grief does not disappear simply because life demands we move forward. It only asks to be honored, and given time. Evelina's tears fell freely now, no longer the careful, contained weeping she had shown him on their wedding night, but something deeper and more honest. Years of suppressed sorrow finally finding release. Alistair stepped closer and, hesitantly at first, opened his arms to her. She hesitated only a moment before stepping into the embrace, her shoulders shaking as she finally allowed herself to grieve openly in the presence of another person, for the first time since Edmund Hale's death. They stood together in the quiet chapel for a long while, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the stone floor, until her tears finally began to ease. When she stepped back, her eyes were red and swollen, but something in her expression had changed. A weight visibly lifted, even if only partially. "Thank you," she said softly. "I did not know how much I needed someone to simply listen, without judgment, without demanding I move past it before I was ready." "You do not need to thank me for that," Alistair replied, "but I do hope you will let me help you carry it, at least a little. From now on, you should not have to face your grief alone any longer." Evelina looked toward the small shelf holding Edmund Hale's letter, portrait, and pressed flower, the modest memorial she had built and maintained in secret for 2 years. "I have kept this hidden because I feared others would think it wrong for a married woman to maintain such a memorial to another man. But I do not wish to hide it any longer, not from you." "Then do not hide it," Alistair said. "If it brings you comfort to remember him properly, to honor what he meant to you, I would never ask you to abandon that. Love does not always follow the paths we expect, and grief deserves acknowledgement, not concealment." They left the chapel together as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. For the first time since their wedding day, Evelina walked beside her husband without the rigid tension that had defined every previous interaction between them. It was not joy, not yet, not the kind of happiness that might one day grow between them, but it was something honest, something real. The first genuine step toward a partnership built not on obligation alone, but on understanding freely given and gratefully received. That evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, Evelina spoke more openly than she had in the entire span of their marriage, sharing small memories of Edmund Hale, of her childhood, of the family she had grown up in before circumstance and loss had reshaped her life so dramatically. Alistair listened to every word, asking gentle questions, offering his own memories in return, and slowly, carefully, a genuine friendship began to take root between them, built on the foundation of a truth finally spoken aloud. She told him of summers spent by a small lake near her childhood home, where she and Edmund had fished together as children long before either of them understood the word courtship. She told him of the letter Edmund had written her the week he first realized his feelings had grown into something deeper than friendship, how clumsy and earnest the words had been, how she had read it so many times the folds of the paper had softened with wear. She told him, too, of the guilt she had carried, unreasonable but persistent, the quiet fear that somehow her own prayers had not been fervent enough, that she might have done something differently in those 3 days of fever to change the outcome. "You could not have changed it," Alistair said gently, when she confessed this final fear. "Illness does not answer to devotion, however deep. You did everything within your power. The rest was never yours to control. I know that, in my mind," she said. "But grief does not always listen to reason. Some nights I still wonder." "Then wonder," he said. "I will not tell you to stop feeling what you feel. I only hope that in time, the wondering brings you less pain than it once did, and that you will let me sit beside you through it, whenever it visits." She looked at him for a long moment, something soft and grateful passing across her features. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am beginning to understand why your father chose you for this arrangement, even without knowing the whole of my circumstances. He must have sensed something of the kindness you carry. Or perhaps he simply hoped 2 lonely people might find their way to each other eventually," Alistair replied, "given enough patience." She smiled then, small and fleeting, but unmistakably real, the first true smile he had seen from her since the day they married. The weeks that followed the revelation in the chapel brought slow, steady change to Rowan Estate, the kind of change that unfolds gradually rather than all at once, like the gentle shift from autumn into winter. Evelina no longer locked her writing desk when Alistair entered a room. The key that once hung hidden beneath her collar now rested openly on a chain she wore without concealment, a quiet symbol that she no longer felt the need to guard her grief as though it were something shameful. She continued her Sunday visits to the small chapel, but now Alistair joined her each time, standing quietly beside her as she spoke softly to the memorial she had built for Edmund Hale, sometimes sharing a memory aloud, sometimes simply standing in comfortable silence. The household staff noticed the change as well. Margaret, the housekeeper, remarked to another servant one afternoon that the Duchess's shoulders no longer carried themselves quite so tightly, that her eyes, while still sometimes shadowed with sorrow, no longer held the same distant, guarded quality they once had. It was not a sudden transformation. Grief, Alistair had come to understand, did not simply vanish once acknowledged. It continued to visit, particularly on difficult days, on the anniversary of certain memories, on quiet evenings, when Evelina's thoughts drifted somewhere he could not follow. But now, instead of retreating alone into locked rooms and careful silence, she allowed him to sit with her through those difficult moments, to offer quiet company even when words felt insufficient. One evening, nearly 2 months after their conversation in the chapel, Evelina approached Alistair in his study, a small bundle of letters held carefully in her hands. "I have been thinking," she said, "that perhaps it is time I read through these properly, rather than simply keeping them locked away out of fear. Would you sit with me while I do?" "Of course," Alistair said, setting aside his correspondence immediately. They sat together near the fireplace as she opened the letters one by one, sharing fragments of what they contained, laughing softly at a particularly awkward early declaration of affection Edmund Hale had written when their courtship first began, growing quiet and thoughtful over letters that spoke of shared dreams for a future that had never come to pass. Alistair listened without jealousy, understanding now that honoring her past did not diminish whatever future they might build together. If anything, her willingness to share this part of herself with him felt like the deepest form of trust she could offer. "I think," Evelina said quietly, folding the last letter carefully and setting it aside, "that I am beginning to understand something I did not before. Loving Edmund does not mean I cannot also build something meaningful with you. I do not think love works in such limited quantities, taking away from one person to give to another. I think perhaps there is room enough in a heart for both grief and new beginnings, if given proper time." Alistair reached for her hand, and this time she did not hesitate to let him hold it. "I am glad you have come to that understanding," he said. "I never wished to compete with his memory, only to earn a place of my own alongside it, whatever that place might eventually become." As winter settled fully over the estate, bringing frost to the windows and early darkness to the evenings, their relationship continued to deepen in small, meaningful ways. They took to reading together each evening, sharing books that had once belonged to Alistair's mother. Evelina began teaching him small details of estate management that had become second nature to her during her weeks of dedicated study, while he shared stories of his own childhood, of his father's occasional gruffness masking a deep and genuine care for his tenants and staff. In those quiet winter evenings, Alistair began to notice small changes that told him more than any words could have. Evelina hummed softly to herself while arranging flowers in the front hall, unaware she was doing it. She began suggesting small improvements to the estate with growing confidence, no longer waiting for his approval before acting on her own good judgment. She laughed, sometimes, at the antics of the estate's cats chasing shadows across the drawing room floor, a light and easy sound that never failed to make him look up from whatever he was doing, simply to watch her. A particular evening in late December brought the first true test of how far they had come. A letter arrived from Evelina's family, requesting she return home for a brief visit, ostensibly to help with preparations for her younger sister's upcoming engagement, but containing an undertone Alistair recognized immediately as a subtle reminder of the family's continued financial dependence on the security her marriage had provided them. Evelina read the letter twice, her expression tightening with old familiar tension, and Alistair watched her carefully, waiting to see whether she would retreat once more into the guarded silence that had once defined her, or whether the trust they had built would hold firm under this new pressure. "They wish me to smile at the engagement celebrations," she said finally, setting the letter down with a small, humorless laugh, "to perform happiness for the sake of family appearances, exactly as I was once asked to do at my own wedding." "You do not have to perform anything you do not feel," Alistair said firmly, "and if you wish, I will accompany you, so that you do not face their expectations alone." She looked at him with something like gratitude and relief mingled together. "I would like that very much." They traveled together to the Marsh family estate the following week, the the carriage ride filled with quiet conversation about what she might expect, which relatives tended toward gentleness and which toward pointed remarks delivered under the guise of concern. Alistair listened carefully, committing names and warnings to memory, determined to be useful rather than merely present. The estate itself was smaller and plainer than Rowan, its gardens neatly kept but lacking the abundance of a household with ready funds, a quiet reminder of the financial strain that had shaped so much of Evelina's recent history. Her mother greeted them at the door with visible relief at the sight of her daughter looking, for the first time in years, genuinely well rather than merely composed. Her father, a stern man with tired eyes, shook Alistair's hand with the particular gratitude of someone who understood exactly how much his family owed to the match, and it was not until Evelina's younger sister, a bright and talkative girl named Charlotte, embraced her warmly, that some of the visit's tension began to ease. Though the visit brought its share of difficult moments, old relatives commenting on how much healthier and settled the Duchess appeared, subtle inquiries about when an heir might be expected, Evelina found herself facing these pressures with a steadiness she had not possessed before. When her aunt made a pointed comment during the engagement dinner, remarking within earshot of several guests that it was well past time for Evelina to set aside old sorrows and focus fully on her new duties as Duchess, the room fell into an uncomfortable hush, several relatives exchanging glances, clearly expecting Evelina to simply absorb the comment as she always had before. Instead, Evelina set down her fork with quiet deliberation and met her aunt's gaze directly. "I have not set aside my grief, Aunt Constance, nor do I intend to, simply because it makes others uncomfortable to witness it. I have learned, this past year, that grief and duty are not opposites requiring me to choose between them. I can honor what I lost while still building a life worth living. I would ask that you extend me the same respect you would wish for yourself, were our circumstances reversed." The silence that followed stretched several long seconds before her aunt, visibly startled by the calm firmness of the response, murmured a stiff apology and turned the conversation elsewhere. Alistair, seated beside his wife, said nothing, but reached beneath the table to briefly press her hand, a small gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than any words he might have offered aloud. Charlotte, seated across from them, caught Evelina's eye afterward and offered her a small, admiring smile, as though seeing her older sister clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. On the carriage ride home, Evelina rested her head against Alistair's shoulder, a small gesture of comfort and trust that would have been unthinkable in the early weeks of their marriage. "Thank you for standing beside me today," she said softly. "Always," he replied, and found that he meant it completely. As the carriage rolled steadily through the quiet countryside toward home, Evelina found herself, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, feeling something close to genuine peace. The grief had not disappeared entirely, and she suspected some part of it never fully would, woven as it now was into the fabric of who she had become. But beside that grief, something new had begun to grow, patient and steady, built on honesty rather than obligation, understanding rather than mere duty. It was not the love she had once imagined sharing with Edmund Hale, and she no longer expected it to be. It was something different, earned slowly through shared vulnerability and quiet, consistent kindness, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was beginning to welcome it into her life with something that felt remarkably close to hope. Spring arrived at Rowan Estate with a gentleness that seemed to mirror the slow transformation that had taken place within its walls over the preceding months. The gardens Evelina had once tended with mechanical duty now bloomed under her genuinely attentive care, and she found herself spending afternoons among the flowers not out of obligation, but out of real pleasure, a small joy she had not permitted herself in years. The anniversary of Edmund Hale's death arrived in early spring, and Alistair watched his wife carefully in the days leading up to it, noting the familiar shadows returning to her eyes, the quiet withdrawal that still visited her during particularly difficult moments. But this time, rather than retreating entirely into solitary grief, she came to him the evening before the anniversary and asked simply if he would accompany her to the chapel the following morning, and perhaps help her plant something new near the small memorial, a living tribute rather than only preserved letters and pressed flowers. They spent that morning together in the chapel garden, planting a small rosebush Evelina had specifically chosen for its resilience, capable of blooming again each year regardless of harsh winters. The gardener had offered to do the digging himself, but Evelina insisted on doing it with her own hands, telling Alistair quietly that some things deserved to be built through effort rather than simply arranged by others. They worked mostly in silence at first, the only sounds the soft scrape of trowels against earth and the distant call of returning spring birds settling into the hedgerows. Alistair found himself content simply to be near her, to share in a task that clearly meant something significant to her, without needing every moment filled with conversation. When the rose bush was finally settled into its new bed of soil, Evelina sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Edmund loved roses, she said finally. He used to say they were proof that beautiful things could grow even from difficult soil, so long as they were given proper care and enough patience. He sounds as though he was a thoughtful man, Alistair said. He was, she agreed. I think, in some strange way, he would have liked you. He always said he hoped that whatever happened in my life, I would find someone who valued kindness above all else. I did not understand, when he said it, that he might have been preparing me for a future without him in it. Perhaps some part of him always feared he would not have long. As they worked side by side in the soft spring soil, Evelina spoke more openly than ever before about her hopes for what her life might yet become, no longer solely defined by the loss that had shaped her for so long, but expanding now to include new possibilities she had once believed closed to her entirely. I think, she said, pressing the last of the soil carefully around the rosebush's roots, that I am ready to try being happy again. Not because I have forgotten Edmund, but because I believe he would not have wanted me to remain forever in mourning. He was not a selfish man. He would have wanted joy for me, even if it came through unexpected paths. Alistair sat back on his heels, watching her with quiet affection that had grown steadily over the preceding months into something he now recognized clearly as genuine love, patient and unhurried, built on the solid foundation of real understanding, rather than the fleeting passion of infatuation. I believe that too, he said. And whatever joy you find, however it arrives, I hope you know I will always support it, even if that joy looks different from what either of us once expected. That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, something remarkable happened, that the staff would speak of fondly for months afterward. As Alistair shared a particularly amusing story about a mishap involving one of the estate's more stubborn horses, Evelina laughed, fully and genuinely, the sound bright and unguarded, filling the dining room in a way it had never been filled before. Margaret, standing near the doorway with a fresh tray of refreshments, paused for a moment, simply to witness it, a small smile of her own spreading across her face at the sight of the Duchess so completely, effortlessly happy. It was not the end of Evelina's grief, and both she and Alistair understood that some sorrows never fully disappear, only soften and integrate themselves into the larger story of a life still being lived. But it marked a genuine turning point, the moment when joy, long suppressed and carefully hidden away, finally began to find its way back into the light, welcomed rather than feared, celebrated rather than concealed. In the months that followed, their marriage continued to deepen into something neither had anticipated on that first difficult wedding night. Evelina's smile, once entirely absent, became a familiar and treasured presence throughout the estate, appearing not through forced performance but through genuine contentment, slowly and steadily earned. Alistair found himself falling more deeply in love with his wife with each passing week, not despite the grief she carried, but because of the courage and honesty with which she had ultimately chosen to face it, and because of the trust she had extended to him in sharing that most private part of herself. The following autumn, Evelina discovered she was carrying their first child, news that arrived with a joy neither of them had fully expected to feel so completely. Alistair, upon hearing it, sat quietly for a long moment before laughing softly, a sound of pure disbelief and gladness that Evelina had never heard from him before. He took her hands in his and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes bright with unshed emotion. I did not think, he admitted, that I would ever feel this fortunate, not after how we began. Nor did I, Evelina said, resting a hand against her middle where their child was beginning to grow. But I have come to believe that some of the best things in life arrive not despite our sorrows, but somehow through them, if we are willing to let them. Their daughter was born the following spring, arriving on a mild morning with the scent of blooming roses drifting through the open window of Evelina's chamber. They named her Grace, a name Evelina had chosen deliberately, a quiet tribute to the patience and mercy that had carried her through the darkest period of her life, and into this unexpected happiness. Alistair held his daughter for the first time with visible wonder, marveling at the small fingers that curled instinctively around his own, and Evelina watched them together with a fullness of heart she had once believed lost to her forever. 2 more children followed in the years after, a son named Henry who shared his father's steady temperament, and a younger daughter, Margaret, named in honor of the housekeeper who had quietly watched over the household through its most difficult season and never once spoken carelessly of what she witnessed. The estate that had once echoed with careful silences now filled instead with the ordinary chaos of a happy household, children's laughter carrying through the halls, Evelina's voice raised often in genuine amusement rather than careful restraint. She never stopped visiting the chapel on quiet Sunday mornings, though the visits grew less frequent as the years passed, evolving from a place of private mourning into something closer to a place of gratitude and remembrance. She would sit sometimes with her children beside the rosebush, telling them small, gentle stories about a kind young man she had once loved deeply, careful always to speak of him with warmth rather than sorrow, teaching her children, without quite meaning to, that love and loss could coexist honestly within a single life, that grief honored rather than buried made a person not weaker, but more capable of loving fully when the chance for new happiness finally arrived. Years later, when their own children asked about the small rosebush that bloomed faithfully each spring near the chapel's side alcove, Evelina would tell them gently about a kind man named Edmund Hale, someone she had loved deeply in her youth, whose memory she still honored with quiet gratitude rather than sorrow. And she would tell them, too, about their father, who had never once asked her to forget her past in order to build a future with him, but who had instead offered her patience, understanding, and the rare gift of being truly seen, exactly as she was, grief and all. The Duke had once left his bride crying alone beneath an oak tree on their wedding night, uncertain and confused by the sorrow he could not yet understand. But he had not walked away for good. He had returned, again and again, with patience and quiet compassion, until the woman behind the tears finally felt safe enough to let him in. And in discovering the truth of why she had never smiled, he had found not a burden to bear, but a partner worth every moment of understanding it had taken to finally earn her trust, and, in time, her genuine and unhesitating love.